has suddenly vanished, one of Henry VIII's ill-fated queens. A sentry, watchful and alert, has fancied that he has heard proceeding from the dungeons of the White Tower, muffled by the immense thickness of the walls, the agonised cries of Guy Fawkes stretched in torture upon the rack. All these things are vague and unsubstantial, as ghosts themselves are, grown about the grey walls of the state prison. The results, my reason tempts me to disbelief, with the assurance of strained watching, of a state of expectation of mind that gives form to just what is expected. Indeed, considering its crowded past, the ghosts of the Tower of London are lamentably few. 3 only have I been able to track down that stood out in circumstantial detail before those who witnessed them. First, a queen's ghost, the queen of unhappy tragedy and of undying pathos, Anne Boleyn. Her window is still pointed out. It lights a little room in the lieutenant's lodgings, facing west, a low, sealed apartment, for it is but 8 feet high, roughly 14 feet square, and panelled throughout with oak. It is kept much in the same state as when Anne Boleyn slept therein her last night on earth. In the year 1864, visiting rounds of the guard within the tower were being made when the officer came upon the sentry posted underneath this window, a rifleman of the 60th Rifles, lying prostrate and unconscious on the ground. The man was court-martialed for being asleep at his post, when he said in his defence that a figure in white approached, that he challenged, but the figure came on, that he charged it with his bayonet, and meeting no resistance fell in a dead faint, in which condition the visiting rounds had found him. At the court-martial, 2 witnesses gave evidence that that night they looked out of the window of the Bloody Tower before going to bed. In the clear, cold moonlight, they also saw a white figure approach the sentry. They heard the sentry challenge, saw him charge the figure with his bayonet, and then fall to the ground. The court acquitted the prisoner. For several years thereafter, other sentries on the spot declared that they had seen the same figure, and the post became of such evil repute that the men tried to avoid it. General Sir George Younghusband, today the keeper of the Crown Jewels, tells the story in his recent book on the Tower from within, it having come to him from the late Major General J.D. Dundas, then a captain in the 60th Rifles, and it is corroborated very closely by Field Marshal Lord Grenfell, who was in the same regiment. The others are, I fear, somewhat ridiculous, sadly falling short of what one has a right to expect a ghost should be in such a place as the Tower. They seem to plead, gibbering, for apology. One of these happened, properly a ghost happens, to none other than a late keeper of the Crown Jewels himself. Late in life, when in his 83rd year, Mr. Edmund Lenthal Swift committed to paper the narrative of his eerie experiences, thinking that it should not pass with him to the grave. He was a public official of merit and distinction, who held his post from 1814 charge was at the time safe kept in the Martin Tower, a stronghold which forms the northwest angle of the inner ward, and there the keeper had living rooms with his family. How the spectre appeared to him, his own words shall tell. One Sunday night in October 1817, I was at supper with my wife, our little boy, and my wife's sister in the sitting room of the Jewel House, which is said to have been the doleful prison of Anne Boleyn. It was not. And of the 10 bishops whom Oliver Cromwell piously accommodated there, the doors were all closed, heavy and dark curtains were let down over the windows, and the only light in the room was that of 2 candles on the table. I sat at the foot of the table, my son on my right, my wife fronting the chimney-piece, and her sister on the opposite side. I had offered a glass of wine and water too. My wife, when on putting it to her lips she paused and exclaimed, "Good God, what is that?" I looked up and saw a cylindrical figure, like a glass tube, something about the thickness of my arm, and hovering between the ceiling and the table. Its contents appeared to be a dense fluid, white and pale azure, like to the gathering of a summer cloud, and incessantly rolling and mingling within the cylinder. This lasted about 2 minutes, when it began slowly to move before my sister-in-law, following the oblong shape of the table, before my son and myself. Passing behind my wife, it paused for a moment over her right shoulder. Observe, there was no mirror opposite in which she could then behold it. Instantly she crouched down, and with both hands covering her shoulder, shrieked out, "Oh Christ, it has seized me!" Even now, as I write, I feel the horror of that moment. I caught up my chair, striking at the appearance with a blow that hit the wainscot behind her. It then crossed the upper end of the table and disappeared in the recess of the opposite window. I rushed upstairs to the other children's room and told the terrified nurse what I had seen. Meanwhile, other domestics had hurried into the parlour, where their mistress was recounting to them the scene, even as I was detailing it above stairs. The marvel, some will say the absurdity, of all this is enhanced by the fact that neither my sister-in-law nor my son beheld the appearance, though to their mortal vision it was as apparent as it was to my wife's and mine. A disappointing ghost indeed, raising expectation high, but denying fulfilment. This should have been a new genii of the tower, forming mysteriously within the tube, boiling, bubbling, fretting, taking form gradually before the eyes of the horrified spectators, bursting his bonds, growing expansive and terrible, filling the room with his loathsome presence, like that other genii in the famous Eastern story of the fisherman and the bottle cast up by the sea. It was an airy monster, taking shape from the agitation within a cylindrical column, just in the same mysterious way that appeared before the Baron de Guildenstub, familiar to students of the occult. What might have developed but for that unseemly blow struck with the chair, denting the wainscoting, none can tell. Notes and Queries discussed the matter some half a century ago, with much learning, but the only materialistic explanation suggested was that of a column of fog descending a damp chimney. Mr. Swift scornfully repelled the idea, as if, said he, the densest fog that ever descended could have seized one of us by the shoulder. The remaining ghost is still apparition also occurred in his time, as ever was opened or closed on a doomed man. The sentry took alarm, as well he might, when the figure of a huge bear issued from beneath the door. Desperate, he struck at it with his bayonet, which stuck fast in the oaken door. Then the man swooned, and his comrades, hastening to the spot, carried him senseless to the guard-room. He was neither asleep nor drunk, but a few moments before the bear emerged, he had spoken to a fellow soldier. He bore a high character for bravery and good conduct. Mr. Swift saw him next morning, trembling and haunted by fear, a man changed beyond recognition. In a day or two the poor fellow died. The body was interred with the military honours in the Flemish burial ground at St. Catherine's by the Tower. Several persons to whom the man spoke attested his tale, the details of which had fixed themselves in his mind and did not vary. Till less than a century ago, the Tower of London was the zoo of the city, possessing cages stored with a curious variety of wild animals, often the gifts of foreign potentates, here royally confined. Who shall decide whether or not this was the shade of some ill-treated Bruin? The late keeper of the crown jewels, it will be noticed, had a pleasant tolerance for ghosts. These, such poor things as they are the authenticated phantoms of the Tower of London, and to my mind they raise a question worth pondering over, for there are many persons among us today who pin their faith on ghosts. It is this: not in all England's broad acres is there another area so small that is so crowded with the tragedy of life as is the Tower. Nowhere were the shades of men and women, violently cut off in their prime, should so thickly congregate, not Rome's Colosseum, not the frowning fortress of St. Peter and St. Paul in Petrograd, no place, I question, in the world. In truth, there is no sadder spot on earth than this little cemetery, wrote Lord Macaulay, of the sheltered church of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower. Death is there associated, not as in Westminster and St. Paul's, with genius and virtue, with public veneration and with imperishable renown, not as in our humblest churches and churchyards, with everything that is most endearing in social and domestic charities, but with whatever is darkest in human nature and in human destiny, with the savage triumph of implacable enemies, with the inconsistency, the ingratitude, the cowardice of friends, with all the miseries of fallen greatness and of blighted fame. Thither have been carried through successive ages by the rude hands of jailers, without one mourner following, the bleeding relics of men who had been the captains of armies, the leaders of parties, the oracles of senates, and the ornaments of courts. This is no more than true, and of all that great company of the silent who should lie uneasily, queens, statesmen, warriors, prelates, and many whose kinship has been their only crime, there is not one whose phantom, living again there, that last bitter hour on earth, has been seen, on testimony that can be accepted by reasoning men. Lenthal Swift's poor shapeless apparition is the very quintessence of feebleness, when this ground should have yielded ghosts so strong. The Tower of London should be the muster ground of ghostly battalions. There is none. It is watched and guarded night and day, centuries in and out, as no other place is watched. If great London, provide one ghostly reappearance that will satisfy. If the tower itself assuredly